The day was sunny, with a gentle breeze blowing across the cobblestones, as the royal guard stood at his post. His uniform was spotless, his posture perfectly straight, and his eyes focused on the crowd that passed by. He had been stationed here, in front of the royal palace, for hours, silently guarding the entrance with a sense of duty and pride. To him, this was more than just a job. It was an honor to protect the palace and its traditions. The royal guards were known for their stoic nature. They never spoke, never showed emotion, and were always perfectly in control. Tourists and visitors often stopped to stare at the guards, trying to catch their attention or get a reaction, but the guards never gave in. They stood like statues, unwavering no matter how silly or rude people could be. It was a part of the tradition, and the tourists loved trying to provoke them. Some would take pictures, others would try to make them smile, but the guards knew how to ignore it all. They had been trained for this moment. Among the crowd, a tourist stood out. He was loud, impatient, and far more focused on himself than anything else around him. He was a man in his late 30s, with a look of arrogance in his eyes. His t-shirt was bright and colorful, a stark contrast to the solemnity of the place. He had a camera slung around his neck, and he was filming the scene, zooming in on the royal guard with a grin on his face. For some reason, the tourist had decided he wanted to get a reaction out of the guard. Maybe it was to impress his friends, or maybe he just thought it would be funny. Whatever the reason, he was about to make a huge mistake. As he walked closer to the guard, he began to taunt him, speaking loudly enough for the people nearby to hear. "Come on, mate, show me something." A smile, a wink, anything. His voice was brash, and he didn't care who heard him. The royal guard didn't flinch. His eyes remained forward, and his stance was as firm as ever. He was used to this kind of behavior. People would often shout or joke around, but the guard never responded. That's what he had been trained to do. His job was to stand still, no matter what, and make sure no one got too close to the royal palace. His composure remained untouched by the words and actions of the crowd. He knew this was part of his duty, a silent power that he carried. But the tourist wasn't backing down. His taunts grew louder and more ridiculous. "You think you're better than me? Look at you, standing there like a statue." He moved even closer to the guard, getting within arm's reach. His grin was wide, almost challenging the guard to do something, anything. The crowd began to notice the interaction, and some people even laughed. The tourist was enjoying the attention, but he didn't realize he was crossing a line. Then, with a sudden, unexpected move, the tourist pulled something from his pocket. It was a canister, small but noticeable. The crowd quieted as they watched the man raise his hand, aiming the canister at the guard's face. The tourist's grin widened, but the royal guard's expression didn't change. The moment stretched out, with the air growing tense. The tourist pressed the nozzle, and a stream of pepper spray shot out, directly into the guard's face. In that moment, time seemed to stop. The crowd gasped. Some people shrieked in shock, and others reached for their phones to capture the scene. But the royal guard, despite the pain, didn't move an inch. He stood still, his eyes squinting in reaction to the burning spray, but his body remained as solid as ever. The tourist, now feeling a strange sense of triumph, stood back, as if he had just won some sort of victory. But little did he know, the events that were about to unfold would quickly make him regret this reckless act. The moment the pepper spray hit the royal guard's face, the crowd fell into a stunned silence. The tourist, feeling a rush of triumph, stepped back slightly, watching the guard's reaction. His grin widened, but it didn't last long. The guard's face twisted with the immediate sting of the spray, and his eyes watered, yet he remained still. The burning sensation from the pepper spray was intense, but the royal guard's training had taught him to endure such challenges without breaking his composure. He fought the urge to wipe his eyes or show any sign of weakness. The crowd, which had been watching curiously, now began to murmur among themselves. Some were shocked, others seemed unsure about what they had just witnessed. The tourist was still standing there, thinking he had won, thinking he had somehow outsmarted the stoic guard. He turned to the people around him, smiling broadly, expecting some applause or approval. He wanted to feel like the center of attention, to be the one everyone would talk about. "Did you see that? I totally got him," he said loudly, his voice full of pride. But instead of the admiration he had hoped for, the crowd seemed to pull back, their expressions shifting from curiosity to discomfort. Some looked at him with judgment, others with disbelief. The reality of what had just happened was beginning to settle in. The tourist's sense of triumph began to feel hollow, and a small sense of unease crept into his mind. Still, he didn't realize the full extent of what he had done. He thought the worst of it was over. After all, the guard hadn't reacted right. The royal guard, though, was not as helpless as the tourist might have imagined. Despite the stinging pain in his eyes, he had been trained to handle situations like this. The training wasn't just about standing still. It was about keeping control of the situation, no matter the circumstances. The guard's hands didn't tremble. His breath didn't quicken. He slowly began to turn his head, his body still stiff and poised, and looked toward the crowd. His eyes scanned the people around him, his face still grimacing, but his posture unyielding. In that moment, the tourist's laugh faded. He began to notice something was different. The crowd was no longer cheering or laughing. Instead, there was a growing sense of tension in the air. His eyes shifted nervously from the royal guard to the people standing nearby, who were now muttering quietly to one another. Without warning, the guard raised one hand, signaling for the situation to stop. It was a small movement, but it carried the weight of authority. And just as the tourist's confidence began to waver, the guard did something unexpected. He called for backup. The sound of a radio crackling to life was heard, followed by the soft but deliberate steps of approaching footsteps. Within moments, 2 more guards appeared, their presence adding a sense of urgency to the scene. The tourist's grin began to falter as the new guards flanked the royal guard. The once confident man suddenly found himself surrounded. The air had shifted from excitement to anxiety. People were still recording the moment, but it wasn't to praise the tourist. The mood had changed entirely. The tourist, still clutching the canister of pepper spray, suddenly felt very small. His chest tightened, and he realized that what he had done might not be as funny as he first thought. The laughter that had once surrounded him now seemed distant, replaced with a feeling of dread. As the new guards stood around him, their eyes locked on the tourist, who now felt the weight of their gaze. This wasn't just a prank anymore. It was an act of defiance that was going to have consequences. The guard, still holding his composure, didn't say a word. But the arrival of backup spoke louder than anything he could have said. The tourist had no idea what was coming next, but he was about to find out in the most unexpected way. The tourist stood there, surrounded by the 2 new guards, feeling a sense of unease that had slowly begun to creep over him. His confident smirk, which had earlier spread across his face like wildfire, had begun to fade, replaced by an anxious twitch at the corner of his mouth. He had thought he would just have a bit of fun, maybe get a laugh out of the crowd, but now things were taking a turn he hadn't anticipated. The once jovial onlookers had gone quiet, and the only sound in the air was the rustling of the wind, as if nature itself had paused to witness what was happening. The royal guard, despite the sting in his eyes, was calm. He stood there, unmoving, as if nothing had happened. His presence, strong and disciplined, seemed to calm the situation, even as the tourist's discomfort grew with every passing second. The 2 additional guards flanked the tourist, their expressions neutral but firm. They didn't speak a word. They didn't need to. Their mere presence was enough to send a clear message to the tourist. He had crossed a line. He was no longer in control of the situation. The tourist tried to muster a smile, but it came out more like a nervous twitch. "Hey, guys, come on. It was just a joke," he stammered, trying to salvage whatever he could from the mess he had made. His voice was shaky now, and his earlier bravado had completely disappeared. But the guards didn't respond. They stood silently, their gaze unwavering, making it clear they weren't interested in jokes. The silence between them grew thick, uncomfortable, and the tourist felt his heartbeat quicken. He glanced around at the crowd, hoping for some kind of support or understanding, but what he saw only made him feel worse. People were no longer smiling. Their faces were serious, and some even looked disappointed, as though they were seeing something they didn't expect to witness. The tourist's stomach churned with guilt. What had started as a way to stand out had now turned into an embarrassing scene. His eyes darted back to the royal guard, who was still standing there like a pillar, unmoving and calm. The tourist took a step back, his body tense with hesitation. He raised his hands, as if trying to show he wasn't a threat. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the issue anymore. The guards were calm and composed, but there was an authority in their stance that made it clear this situation was no laughing matter. His mind raced as he tried to think of a way out, some way to make things right. But the more he thought, the more hopeless it seemed. "Look, I'm really sorry," he said, his voice quieter now, tinged with panic. "I didn't mean it. I just thought it would be funny, you know. You're a royal guard, and I'm just a tourist. I wasn't thinking. Please, just let me go." But the guards remained silent, their faces impassive. They didn't respond to his apology. It was as if they were waiting for him to truly understand the gravity of what he had done. They weren't going to let him off easy. In that moment, the tourist realized he wasn't going to just walk away from this. There were consequences to his actions, and those consequences were quickly catching up with him. The royal guard's eyes, though still watering from the pepper spray, narrowed slightly. He took a deep breath and slowly, methodically, reached for his radio. He pressed a button, speaking into it with calm precision, though his voice was barely audible to anyone around. The response was immediate, and within moments, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed in the distance. More guards were on their way. The tourist's heart sank. This wasn't a joke anymore. The backup wasn't just there to assist. They were there to handle a situation. And in that moment, the tourist knew that there was no escaping the reality he had brought upon himself. The sound of footsteps grew louder, echoing off the stone pavement. The tourist stood frozen, his mind racing as he realized that help was on the way. Not for him, but against him. He glanced at the royal guard, whose composure remained unshaken, even as his face showed the effects of the pepper spray. The guard's unflinching calmness had somehow made the situation even more intense. The air around them felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. The additional guards that had appeared seemed to exude authority with every step. Their uniforms were pristine, and their movements were smooth and synchronized, as if they were part of a well-rehearsed routine. There was no anger or rush in their actions, but the intensity of their presence was undeniable. They closed in on the tourist, their eyes never leaving him. It was clear to anyone watching that they were not simply there to defuse the situation. They were there to ensure the tourist paid the price for his reckless behavior. The tourist's anxiety grew. His earlier bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by a sinking feeling in his stomach. He tried to take a deep breath, but it didn't help. The words he had said before seemed foolish now, and he could feel the weight of the crowd's judgment pressing down on him. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The smile that had once been on his face had long since disappeared, replaced by a nervous twitch of his lips. As the new guards surrounded him, the tourist felt like a deer caught in headlights. They weren't saying anything. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to make him realize that this wasn't some harmless prank. This was serious, and he was in the wrong. He tried to back away, but the guards were too close. His mind raced, but every thought seemed to be drowned out by the pounding in his chest. He was trapped. One of the new guards spoke for the first time, his voice calm but firm. "You will come with us." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a command. The tourist opened his mouth to speak, to protest, but nothing came out. His mind was in a panic, and his throat felt tight. He tried again. "Wait, I didn't mean to cause trouble. I'm just a tourist." The guard didn't flinch or show any sign of sympathy. He stepped closer, making it clear that the tourist's apologies were falling on deaf ears. The other guards kept their eyes on the tourist, standing close but not touching him. Yet, the silent pressure of their presence was enough to make the tourist feel small, insignificant. In the distance, more guards appeared, coming from behind the palace gates. The sight of them only heightened the tourist's sense of dread. There were no more jokes, no more distractions. The situation was real, and the consequences of his actions were now unavoidable. His attempt to laugh it off or get out of the situation with a few words had failed. The reality of what he had done was setting in, and it was far worse than he could have imagined. The air grew tense as the new guards stood still, watching him closely. One of them signaled for him to move, and the tourist had no choice but to follow. His legs felt heavy, as if he were walking through mud, and his thoughts were a jumble. He had no idea what was going to happen next, but he knew he had messed up in a way that couldn't be undone. As he was led away from the palace gates, the crowd began to disperse, many still talking about the bizarre scene they had just witnessed. Some people shook their heads, others looked on with quiet curiosity. But the tourist couldn't focus on them anymore. All he could think about was how quickly everything had spiraled out of control. He had wanted attention, but this wasn't what he had imagined. The royal guards had shown him something far more powerful than a quick laugh or moment of fame. They had shown him the consequences of disrespecting authority. The tourist was being led away, his feet dragging with each step as the guards gently but firmly guided him toward the side of the royal palace. The reality of the situation was sinking in deeper now. It wasn't just that he had sprayed pepper spray at a royal guard. It was the way everything had unraveled so quickly. His earlier thoughts of this being some harmless prank now felt distant, as if they belonged to another person entirely. As the group walked, the tourist couldn't help but glance around, hoping for someone to speak up on his behalf, or perhaps for the guards to suddenly lighten up. But there was nothing. The crowd, once curious and entertained by his actions, had now scattered. The few people who remained stood watching with neutral expressions, many still holding up their phones to capture the unfolding scene. No one was laughing. No one was offering support. The tourist, once so full of confidence, now felt utterly alone. His mind raced with thoughts of how to fix this. Maybe if he apologized enough, they would let him go. Maybe the guards had misunderstood the situation. He opened his mouth, ready to speak again, but stopped himself. What could he possibly say? Every word that had come out of his mouth so far had only made things worse. The idea of pleading for mercy seemed like a pointless exercise now. He had made a serious mistake, and there was no way to undo it. As they reached a quieter area, one of the guards, who had been walking just a step behind him, turned to face him. The guard's expression was unreadable, and his tone was as calm as ever when he spoke. "You will wait here until further instructions." The tourist nodded, unsure of what was coming next. He stood silently, his hands trembling slightly at his sides, his mind trying to figure out what would happen next. What was the punishment for what he had done? Would they arrest him? Would he face some kind of fine? Or worse, would they press charges? The guard who had spoken moved a little away, standing a few feet from him, his back straight and his gaze unwavering. The tourist tried to catch his eye, hoping for a sign that he could still make things right. But the guard's expression didn't change. He might as well have been a statue, standing firm and silent. Time passed slowly as the tourist waited. Every minute felt like an hour. His thoughts wandered to the events that had led him here, how he had been so determined to provoke the royal guard for no reason other than his own amusement. He had wanted to see what would happen, to see if he could get a reaction out of someone who was supposed to remain completely stoic. But now, as the consequences of his actions set in, he wished he could take it all back. A part of him tried to justify it, telling himself that it wasn't such a big deal. It was just a bit of pepper spray, right? The guard was fine. But another part of him, the part that was beginning to understand the seriousness of what he had done, knew it wasn't just about the pepper spray. It was about respect, or rather, the complete lack of it. The sound of approaching footsteps broke his thoughts. Another group of royal guards appeared, and the tourist immediately straightened, hoping they would show some mercy. But the new arrivals were just as stoic and serious as the others. They didn't look at him with any sense of sympathy, only with the same unwavering gaze they had shown earlier. The sense of dread that had been building in the pit of his stomach grew even stronger. One of the guards turned to the tourist, his tone businesslike. "You'll be escorted off the premises. You're not to return here under any circumstances. Do you understand?" The tourist nodded, his throat tight. He had no words left to say. His earlier bravado was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of regret. He had been given a chance to redeem himself, but now it was too late. There was no way to undo what he had done, and the punishment was becoming clearer by the minute. As the guards began to walk him away from the palace, the tourist couldn't help but feel the weight of his actions. What he had thought would be a moment of amusement had turned into a life lesson, and it wasn't one he would soon forget. The tourist walked quietly between the two royal guards, his shoulders hunched as they led him away from the royal palace. Each step felt heavier than the last, the reality of the situation weighing down on him more with every passing moment. His mind was a swirl of thoughts, regrets, and unanswered questions. What had started as a moment of misguided humor had spiraled into something far beyond his control. Now he was being escorted off the palace grounds, a clear reminder of how quickly things could change. As they reached the side gates of the palace, the tourist noticed how the guards seemed to move with purpose, their steps deliberate and unwavering. They were so calm, so collected, as if they had dealt with situations like this many times before. Their professionalism only made the tourist feel smaller. He had thought he could get away with it, but now he saw that these guards were not like the typical security personnel he was used to. They were more than just enforcers. They were guardians of something much greater, and he had disrespected that. He tried to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe, just maybe, if he apologized one more time, they would show mercy. But deep down, he knew it wasn't about an apology anymore. The guards weren't there to listen to excuses. They were there to uphold the law, to ensure that the respect for the royal traditions was maintained, and he had clearly crossed a line. The tourist glanced over at the guards. They weren't looking at him. Their focus was entirely on the task at hand. His presence was irrelevant to them. The crowd had all but disappeared now, leaving the tourist to face the consequences alone. There was no one else around to witness his humiliation. It felt as if the world had suddenly become very quiet, except for the sound of his own footsteps echoing against the cobblestones. As they passed the final gate, the tourist's anxiety grew. He could see the vehicle waiting for him just ahead. It was a standard black van, unmarked and simple, but its presence felt like a final reminder that his actions had consequences. His mind raced with the possibilities of what might happen next. Would they just send him on his way with a warning? Or would there be more serious consequences for what he had done? The closer he got to the van, the more his stomach churned. He felt embarrassed, but also ashamed of himself. His thoughts kept replaying the moment when he had sprayed the pepper spray of the royal guard. It seemed like such a silly, insignificant thing to do at the time, but now it felt like the biggest mistake of his life. He had acted without thinking, motivated by nothing more than a desire to be seen, to get attention, to be funny. But in the process, he had lost all sense of respect, and now he was paying the price. As the guards opened the door to the van, the tourist finally spoke. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "I'm really sorry. I didn't mean for it to go like this." One of the guards turned slightly to acknowledge his apology, but said nothing. The other guard, who had been silent throughout the ordeal, gave a small nod, signaling for him to get in the vehicle. There was no comfort in their actions, no kindness in their eyes. The tourist understood. There was no room for forgiveness here. He had crossed a line, and there was no way to erase what he had done. He climbed into the van, feeling the weight of his actions heavier than ever. As the door slammed shut behind him, he was alone with his thoughts. The ride was silent, and the only sound was the hum of the engine as they drove away from the palace. The feeling of embarrassment gnawed at him, but in its place, another emotion began to take root: regret. He couldn't help but think back to the guard, standing tall and unmoving after being sprayed in the face, showing a level of professionalism and composure the tourist couldn't have imagined. The guard had maintained his dignity, and in doing so, had made the tourist's actions seem even more foolish. What had seemed like an act of rebellion had turned out to be a clear display of disrespect. The van continued to drive, but the tourist wasn't thinking about where it was taking him. His mind was still stuck on the moment of his mistake. It wasn't just about getting caught. It was about what his actions had represented. He had taken something sacred, something that stood for discipline, tradition, and respect, and he had tarnished it for his own amusement. Now, as the van drove further away from the royal palace, he knew that he had learned a valuable lesson, the hard way. And that lesson would stay with him for the rest of his life. The ride felt endless as the van sped down the road, the hum of the engine almost lulling the tourist into a trance-like state. His mind was filled with thoughts, but none of them were clear. Every few moments, his mind would flash back to the event. The spray of pepper in the royal guard's face, the shock in the crowd, the silence that followed, and finally, the realization that he had made a huge mistake. His chest tightened as he thought of how quickly everything had spiraled out of control. The tourist tried to push those thoughts aside, but they kept creeping back in. It was no longer just about the moment he had sprayed the pepper spray. It was about how naive and foolish he had been to think he could get away with it. He had assumed that because he was a tourist, because he was just one person among so many others, his actions wouldn't matter. But now, it was clear to him that respect and authority were not things you could simply dismiss when it suited you. The van took a turn, and the buildings outside started to look more familiar, less like the area near the royal palace. They were heading toward the outskirts of the city, where there were fewer people, quieter streets. He could feel the weight of the silence in the van. The guards hadn't said a word since they had left the palace gates, and the tourist hadn't known what to say either. What was there to say? How could he explain himself? No words could take back the moment of arrogance that had led to this. He thought of the guard, standing so still after being sprayed. Even with the pain of the pepper spray, the guard had remained unwavering. He had shown no signs of weakness. He had been professional in every way. And the more the tourist thought about it, the more he realized how much he had misjudged the situation. The guard wasn't just there to stand still. He was a symbol of something greater, something that demanded respect. And in his attempt to challenge that respect, the tourist had failed, and now he was facing the consequences. The sound of the van's tires against the pavement was the only noise breaking the silence, and the tourist began to feel the full weight of what he had done. He had been impulsive, disrespectful, and thoughtless. And now, it seemed like the universe had made sure he would never forget that lesson. He had disrespected the royal guard, disrespected the traditions they stood for, and in doing so, he had shown how easily pride and arrogance could lead to ruin. As the van continued, the tourist found himself reflecting on his past actions more and more. What had he been thinking when he'd sprayed the guard in the face? What was the point? To prove that he could get a reaction. To make himself feel powerful in front of a crowd. He had made a fool of himself, and that truth was starting to sink in deeper with every minute that passed. But it wasn't just about feeling foolish. It was about the deeper realization of how little he had understood about the situation. The royal guard wasn't just a figure standing there for decoration. He was a person, performing a duty, and the tourist's actions had undermined that duty. It wasn't just about one person's pride. It was about respect for authority, for tradition, for the work that people do every day. The van came to a slow stop, and the sound of the engine winding down seemed to bring the tourist back to the present. He looked out the window, but all he saw was a plain, quiet street. The realization was dawning on him. The consequences of his actions were far more serious than he had imagined. The car door opened with a slight creak, and one of the guards motioned for him to step out. His heart raced as he did, the feeling of guilt gnawing at him. The moment of reckoning was here, and there was no turning back. The tourist had learned the hard way. Respect could not be demanded, it had to be earned. And in that moment, he truly understood the gravity of his mistake. As the tourist stepped out of the van, he felt the cool airbrush against his face, a stark contrast to the suffocating tension that had been building inside him since the moment he had sprayed the pepper spray of the Royal Guard. His hands were still trembling slightly, his mind still clouded with regret. He wasn't sure where this moment would lead, but he knew that he had crossed a point of no return. The weight of the consequences was now unavoidable. The guards who had escorted him stopped at the entrance of a small plain building. It was a far cry from the grandeur of the palace, and as the tourist looked around, he realized it was some kind of holding facility. He had no idea what was going to happen next, but a sense of dread washed over him. He had thought he could get away with something harmless, something that was just a silly prank. But now, standing here, he realized how wrong he had been. It was far more serious than he had ever imagined. The guards motioned for him to follow them inside, and he did so without a word. The building was quiet, with only the faint sound of footsteps echoing down the empty hallways. His mind kept returning to the same question. What would happen to him now? Would he be arrested? Would there be a fine? He wasn't sure what to expect, but one thing was certain. He wasn't leaving here the same person he had been when he arrived. They led him down a corridor and into a small, sterile room. It was simple, nothing more than a desk, a couple of chairs, and a single window letting in just enough light to illuminate the dull gray walls. The tourist was instructed to sit, and he obeyed, his body stiff with anxiety. His mind was spinning, his thoughts unable to settle on anything except the overwhelming sense of foolishness and regret that now filled him. After a few minutes, a man entered the room. He wasn't in uniform like the royal guards, but his demeanor was just as serious. The man glanced at the tourist and sat across from him, his eyes piercing but not unkind. For a moment, the room was silent as the man studied the tourist, who struggled to meet his gaze. Finally, the man spoke. "You've made a mistake," he said simply, his voice calm but firm. "Do you understand that?" The tourist nodded, his throat tight. He didn't trust himself to speak just yet. He had made the mistake, and he knew it. No words could change what had happened, but somehow hearing it from someone else made it even more real. He had thought he could get away with something so small, so harmless. But now he understood the true weight of what he had done. The man leaned back in his chair. "It's not just about the pepper spray," he continued. "It's about the respect you failed to show for tradition, for authority, for the work that others do." The tourist's head dropped, the sting of the man's words sinking in deeper than he had expected. He hadn't thought of it that way. In his mind, it had been about making a point, about getting a laugh. But now, as he sat there, he realized how much he had underestimated the value of respect. The respect for people, for roles, for systems that kept things in order. "Do you understand what this means?" the man asked again, his voice softer but still firm. The tourist nodded again, finally able to speak. "I do. I'm sorry. I never should have done it." His voice cracked slightly, the weight of his apology much heavier than he had anticipated. The man didn't say anything for a moment. Then, finally, he stood up, his expression unreadable. "This will be dealt with. You'll be given a chance to learn from this. But understand this, next time, things may not turn out as easily." The tourist's stomach tightened. He didn't know if this was a warning or a form of leniency, but the man's words felt like a final judgment. He stood up slowly, still feeling the sting of humiliation, but also something else, relief, perhaps. He had learned his lesson, perhaps the hardest way possible. But he would not forget it. As the man escorted him back toward the exit, the tourist couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. The instant karma of the situation, the overwhelming consequences of what had seemed like a small, harmless prank. He couldn't help but wonder how many others went through life without realizing the importance of respect. How many others would make the same mistake he had made. But that wasn't his problem anymore. He had learned what it meant to respect others, to understand that certain roles in society demanded more than just casual recognition. They demanded honor. And now, as he stepped out of the building and into the daylight, he knew that he would never take that for granted again. The lesson, while hard, had been a necessary one, and he would carry it with him for the rest of his life.